Good afternoon, everybody. I hope you can all hear me. I can see a bunch of hands. That's fantastic. Okay, so we're going to kick off. We're going to talk about game design, particularly around engagement and retention. Obviously, that's why we're here. It's part of this program we have about our monetization masterclass that we've been running. And it's a part of the program. This is the webinar where we'll talk about the principles. And for those of you who are interested, we also have a premium experience where you get to have a workshop where you get hands-on to try and test your own understanding and application of some of these principles. Just as a little kind of hint, I'm not going to specifically deal with examples in the real world with real games. There's a reason for that. Well, two reasons, really. One is it's a lot quicker to talk about the principles without that. But secondly, it's actually very hard to come up with clean examples. There's never a perfect game that does everything in all of the right ways, because every game experience is subjective and rich and deep in its own right and has its own ways and means. And what we're going to try and do is teach you some of the principles behind the decisions you're going to make to ensure that your game design is as effective as possible. So that's what we're going to try and do. We'll probably have a few more people joining us. So what I'll do is I'll start off gently. We've got such a lot to go through, but I want to start off gently and just explain for those of you who may not know who I am, a little bit about who I am. So I'm Oscar Clark. I've been around in the industry for a very long time. I've been working in games since 1998. And as part of that, I've worked on mostly games as a service, online experiences, and that's been on mobile, on PC, and on console. I've done a lot of work as evangelism. I've worked with the Pocket Gamer guys to host a lot of events and write a bunch of articles. But obviously, I'm here bringing you the experience that I've had designing and working and consulting on games about game design and monetization. So with that in mind, why don't we just get straight into it? So I'm going to ask the most important question, which everybody should ask before they're endeavoring into anything to do with the game. And that is, why should the player care? Honestly, this is the most important question. I don't mind that you want to make a game for yourself. That's fine. But why should the player care? Well, actually, it turns out that there's been some research and analysis about what actually makes people care about games. There are things that we need to know in terms of understanding the essentially kind of like the whys and wherefores. So we want to seek competence. We want to seek completion. We want control, which is also kind of like an element of escape, how we feel like we're escaping from our constraints of our world. A game, if you go by Johannes Huizinga's kind of principle about what in Homo Ludus, it's something which is separate from the real world. That's why we are not gambling. That's why we're not work. That's why play to earn is problematic every time someone tries to do it. We have to be separate from the real world, or we are not a game. We're not playful. And actually, control is also another aspect of the rules aspect of games. Games generally have rules that we are exploring. But then there's also things like social capital. These are all massively important reasons why we play games, and we should not underestimate their importance. So let's move on from that. There's another stage of this. So obviously, we're commercial game makers. At least I hope we are. I mean, that's why we're here, isn't it? We want to be able to make games that are successful, that are going to be profitable enough, even if that's just to make the next game. And hopefully a little bit more than that. Now, that means that we have to understand why we pay as well. Interestingly, they're not that dissimilar. So we have to think about things like, fear of missing out. We have to think about things like, anticipation. We have to think about abnegation. Oh, I'm going to move myself over here so you can read that. What is abnegation? Abnegation is when the player decides to put aside the things they should be doing, like, washing up, doing reading that particular book, finishing off The Bear. Yes, I haven't finished the third series of The Bear. I will. But the thing is, I choose to do that. I choose to abnegate the other things I should be doing. You can't change that. you can create the conditions where they're going to choose your game. Sure, absolutely. But at the end of the day, we are not manipulating, controlling players. At least we're not going to be successful in the very long term if we don't fundamentally understand that it is a player choice to play your game. And that's a good thing. What we want to do is give them reasons to care, reasons to want to do it. And if we get that right, what we do is we build engagement. Retention is based on engagement, and revenue is based on retention. They are entirely connected. We also have to think about the player life cycle. The player life cycle isn't just a moment of play. It's a ongoing engagement. If you are trying to move away from what they did in hyper casual to have an instant moment of play and that's it, if instead what you want to do is to create something which is sustainable, that is going to hold an audience's attention, if you don't pay attention to the life cycle of that player, you're dead in the water. And that means we have to take on board the onboarding process, the leveling of enthusiasm that we'll see at that first install. But how many people will be losing if we don't manage to grab them at the bottom of that pit of despair and bring them up and help them properly engage with the experience? If we do that well, we'll get to the point where we get retention, where we sustain that audience over time. And eventually we may end up with what we call fandom. Now, you'll notice I did not say whale. Whales do not exist in games. Well, that's not true, but it's not useful. Whales is a useful term for gambling. That's not what's happening in good games. That's not what's happening in engaging play experiences, because games need to be separate from the real world. This is where we have fandoms. We have audiences. We are creating content. And to maximize the impact of our content, we have to remember that we're building for fans. And if a fan can afford £1 a month, they're just as important and valuable as a fan that can afford £1,000 a month. Don't get me wrong, I like the fans that have £1,000 a month that they want to give to our game. But if they're not doing it with the same open mind, if they can't afford to do that, we will cause ourselves greater damage down the line than we can imagine. Now, that's because I want to have a sustainable long-term game that lasts years. And if that's what you want, then you'll see how we're going to tap into that by understanding the underlying design. Hopefully that makes sense. So let's kick off the proper talk. So what we're going to start, we're going to start by looking at the core loop. Now, we all know what the core loop is. The core loop is something that's pretty obvious. We have a start condition, we have a challenge, we have a resolution, the thing that we do, and then we have a reward. Great, that sounds nice and easy. Well, we also have to think about what the reasons why we play. There are numerous reasons why we play. We can look at, where current players feeling bored, they need to relax, they need to stimulate their mind. What need states is your game specifically trying to resolve? What are you tapping into in the player experience? If you don't understand why people choose your game, guess what? They're not going to be thinking about your game the next time they're in that mood state. Again, this is about tapping into life cycle and also, what primary needs of players. Oh, sticking there on the old slides. Hopefully it will take me back to where I want to go. Right, so we're back to the core loop. We're going to talk a little bit more about the core loop. So what we're going to talk about here is, if the slides will work properly. So we're going to talk about how the game has that start condition, that challenge, that resolution, getting that flow, getting that understanding of how you get people from the point where you establish the principles about what the game is about. That's massively important. And this is going to become incredibly important when we think about first-time user experience. We've got to think about setting up a challenge, an expectation. And it's not just for now, it's also for future play. Why would I come back? Where will that be? So whilst you might, in a first-time user experience, think about making sure that the game's easy to play, so you see satisfaction and get something useful out of it, if you don't explain how it is going to be challenging, why I'm going to feel good playing it, how it's going to scratch that itch, you're not going to get that. But also understanding what the role of rewards. Now, what I'm going to try and do is explain the flow. So it's not just about these specific things. It's about understanding how the start condition moves us from a state of that kind of relaxation to a state of tension. How it means that when we go from the challenge to the resolution, we're moving from anticipation to fear of missing out. What if we mess it up? What if we don't get it right? What if we don't get our reward? But then also, as we go from the resolution to the reward, we need to move from that tension back to a sense of relief. And importantly, we must not completely satisfy the user's expectation. We need to leave enough space, enough anticipation for them to want to do it again. And that is the thing that becomes really interesting. Because when we start thinking about that, we start thinking about the flow of a user as they start with the start condition and they move through anticipation through to tension, they move through the challenge, they move through the resolution stage and the fear of missing out, and back to the reward. You can see how they can have this flow. And if we get it right and we leave enough sense of fear of missing out, we can encourage people to want to do the next step. And that fear of missing out can be a number of things. It doesn't have to be a negative emotion. It can simply be, I think I can do this better next time. It can simply be, I want the next reward. I want to see what's over the hill. Those things are really important. We also need to make sure that we think specifically about the first time user experience. And that means making sure that that process, when we start playing, is simple, really, really simple, keeping it simple. Teaching one thing. The Nintendo method is probably the most quoted version, where I introduce something. I essentially, having introduced a thing, I then allow you to master it, so get good at it. I then provide you with a challenge before I introduce any new concepts. Then we want to encourage people to learn, not by telling them what to do, but by letting them play. I'm a big fan of having triggers that tell you, oh, you didn't move the mouse this way, which is the way you're supposed to move it. Therefore, we'll prompt you, but we won't do it immediately. We'll see what you do first before we tell you the tutorial steps. Now, that's my preference, not always possible, particularly if you've got game systems that are new and innovative. But if you've got a game system that already exists, that people are already familiar with, don't teach me how to do a match 3 game again when I've already learned how to do it 300 times. Let me explore. And if I get it wrong, then prompt me, oh, try this instead. And do that in a positive way. Then we also need to think about kind of how we're feeding a craving, how we're establishing the player's emotional desire to play, how we're satisfying them in that process. Getting that working is incredibly important. And then we move further forward into foreshadowing. If your first time user experience is not foreshadowing why I'm coming back in 20 minutes, why I'm coming back in an hour, in 4 hours, I'm not going to get the audience to stay playing my game. It's just not going to work. So first time user experience is normally, when I'm called in to rescue a game, 99% of the time, it's the first time user experience, which is the fundamental problem. There are some exceptions, but that's generally the key thing. Some other little nuance elements that you need to think about in terms of this process. In particular, success must feel attainable. Attainable really matters. But it also, you have to not be frightened of being, the failure is a possibility. I'm a massive fan of Mythbusters. Failure should always be an option. So success is not certain. You have no sense of achievement if you felt that success was certain. Absolutely massively important. But also, failure mustn't feel unfair. Think about the flow of the game. If it feels that the game made you fail, the player will feel bitter and angry. If the player feels they could do one thing differently and be better at the game, they are going to feel more satisfied and more encouraged to play again. And that is what we're after here. Engagement starts with giving a reason to play again. If we fail at that, we are not going to get retention. We are not going to have a live experience. We're not going to have a sustainable audience. Massively, massively important. Another thing I'm going to throw at you. Think about how you set up your game rules and systems. Can you put them into configurations? Can you set them up on a server? For example, the physics, the gravity, the reaction time, the amount of damage per second, the amount of distance you travel, the waiting time for a weapon to reload, or the waiting time for an object to respawn, the movement rate. If all of those things can be configured on the server, you've done yourself a massive, massive advantage, because you can test quicker without having to have a brand new build. You can also create, especially if you set this up so you can schedule, you can create game modes and configs without requiring another coder. Incredibly important. Now, why am I saying it with engagement retention? Well, if you think about the way you set up your rules for your game and you think of it with configuration in mind, it's going to make it easy for you to think about what is going to make this repeatable mechanic feel interesting. Where are the power-ups going to come from? Where are the engagements going to come from? Where's the reason to do it again? And most importantly, where's the optimization going to come? Next thing I'm going to talk about very quickly is, oh, he says it's gone too far, is making sure we don't assume that we're right. There are lots of tools out there. I've taken some very scrappy examples because it's hard to share real stuff. So I've just thrown these together as random things. Think about the funnel on onboarding, use your data to analyze what's going on. I can give you a whole lecture on data setup. In fact, we did some work for the Information Commission Office on best practice for data capture for the age appropriate design code, which is like the UK's kind of improvement next step on from GDPR. So anyway, I'm not going to go into how you set up your data. That's for another time. But set up your data, use your data, understand the flow of players through your experience. Make sure you can map that so you can see where the problems are. And look at that gap. That gap looks problematic. I'm going to fix what it is that made that gap work. It's massively important, because if you can get your funnels working as optimally as possible, your chance of retaining and sustaining an audience goes up dramatically. So again, we're going to look now at, what we've done so far is talk about the first stage, the core loop. I'm now going to move into the second stage. We're now going to talk at the layer above that, which I call the context loop. Lots of people have other words for it. Some people will call this the meta. I don't think that's as good a language for this. But yeah, that's one of those things that we were trying to do. I just noticed that there's a few comments that have come up in the Q&A. Catherine, I don't know if it's possible to unlock the chat. Apparently, people can't use the chat system to post information. If not, don't worry, we can use the Q&A. I can see Jack asking, in fact, there's Jack, an anonymous user, asking if you'll get the slides. We can make the slides available. Actually, I think Casual Gorilla, yeah, you're that. And I can talk about the config stuff that will be in a different session though. So all we're talking about at the moment in terms of config is just making sure that you think about how you can put your setup on your server so you can respond as quickly as possible. Hopefully that helps answer some of those live questions. Now I'm going to focus back onto the context loop. So we talked about the core loop, so the core base principle, the thing that we do in the game. The context loop is kind of like the why we do these things. Now here we're going to have things like the purpose, sense of purpose as it's like the equivalent of the start condition. We're talking about progression, optimization, and so on and so forth. But let's move on and let's talk about where this model comes from, where this thinking comes from. Fantastic book out there called Hooked. It's a great way of understanding habit forming behavior. It's not game specific. There is one specific on games, which is something like Hooked on Games. I can't remember the specific publisher, but I'm happy if offline people want to reach out to me. I'm very happy to share these things. We'll send out, if people reach out to me, I'll happily send out some links of books I find really useful. This is a method. You have a trigger, you have an action, you have a variable reward, you have an investment. So if people have an investment, they're likely of continuing. Hey, this looks pretty much like what we said about the core loop. We have a start condition, a challenge, a resolution, and a reward, our investment. This is what happens very much with the context loop, with the sense of purpose, progression, optimization, and narrative. So let's talk about those a bit more as well. So we're going to start off in the context loop. We're talking about purpose. Now, what this means is, are you setting out why the things that you do in this game, the core loop, matter? Why are you doing them? Why are you actually thinking about them? Why are they important? How are you going to make them operate? Thinking about that matters. It's really, really important. But once you've established that, you need to show me how far I'm getting in that. I need to see how far I've come, how far I've got to go to. If you don't tell me I'm going somewhere in your game experience. Now, a classic example of this are leveling up, ranking up, opening new regions, opening new chapters, opening up new game modes. But you've got to establish why I should care. What's my sense of purpose? I'm only going to keep playing if I understand that and embrace that. And if I can see where I'm going next, I've only got to do one more thing to unlock the next level. If I unlock the next level, I unlock these opportunities. That is massively motivational to sustain an audience to play. So, thinking about that, these are all good things, he says. But also, we want to think about optimization. One of the most satisfying things in a game is when I look at the framework and the structures of the mechanics and I try to perfect my method. Amazingly powerful motivation to stay playing, amazingly powerful motivation to play the next game, the next game, the next game. Now, again, another reason why this matters is it's also really interesting. If you look at those games that are incredibly viral, incredibly engaging, incredibly sustainable, they usually have some ambiguity in the best tactics. So they become a point for debate. They become a point for exploration. They become, something like Magic the Gathering is probably one of the best examples. I guarantee you, somebody will tell you that the deck they've just made is the best deck in the world and it can't be beaten. And then somebody will beat it. That's powerful. Optimization, tweaking, establishing people's desire to play, massively, massively important. And I think we underestimate optimization at our peril. It's massively important for building reinforceable, engaging games. And then there's a narrative. Tell me why I should care emotionally. Make me immersed in the story. Games are incredible at telling stories. And whether you've got a linear experience, and by the way, most of the design I'm talking about here is not about linear experience. But if you've got a linear experience or an ongoing play experience, you can still tell stories. Look at the way that Skyrim or Fallout tells these moments of story that make me feel immersed in the world, that make me feel engaged. They're incredibly sustainable because I'm finding and discovering moments. There are different ways to tell stories. One of my favorite ways is to have community activities that then feed the narrative for the next season. So let's say we've got 3 factions, gold, silver, and bronze. Okay, 3 factions. We're fighting against Cerberus. Which faction did the most damage against Cerberus that month? And that could be the big narrative kind of moment. And then the next month, we defeated Cerberus. We now are exploring the River Styx. We get to see what's happening in the underworld because of Silver Team, who were the ones who unlocked it because they defeated Cerberus once and for all. How do we know that? Because the Silver Team are the one that had the highest number of points. What does that mean? That means everyone on Silver Team is getting a bonus reward because they all participated in that success. So narrative can be incredibly well told. It can be done in really interesting ways. And don't get me started on the opportunity I think we have with long-term retention games where we use the same principles of soap operas in the way we tell the stories. Still not being done today. But what I think is also important is to remind ourselves, where is the emotion? Do you remember what we said last time when we looked at these 4 steps? It's not just about the 4 steps. It's about the emotional journey we're taking people through. We're taking people through from that initial sense of purpose through to a progression, and that's creating a sense of tension. So going from relief to tension. We're then going from that sense of purpose to optimization, where we're then building that sort of sense of fear of missing out. What if I don't get it right? What if I don't optimize it properly? And then going from there into the the kind of narrative side, where I get this payoff, this satisfaction. I still want to know more. That's why things like soap opera narrative are so powerful, because what will happen next month, next time, on game name X, this could happen. You'll never guess what happens next. With so many techniques that we can use to emotionally engage the player. If you're just looking at your game design flat as a functional, you are not going to keep your audience. Engagement means emotion. It's important to do. I notice that there's a few people talking about access to the recording. Yes, we will be making a recording available to you all later. Don't worry, have no fear. And I'm sorry for those guys who are having trouble with power outages. And these things do happen, however. Okay, so hopefully I've taken you on this journey. I've got you thinking about the core loop. I've now got you thinking about the context loop. There's some other things about the context loop that's worth paying attention to, which is, you remember this life cycle, the player life cycle? This is incredibly important. The player, the context loop isn't just about today's session. The core loop is about the thing we do now. The context loop is about keeping me playing, sustaining me playing. So again, we have to think about the transitions of the player, not just the emotions, but the transitions, because what they're going to need from the game as they go from onboarding to engagement, from engagement to retention, and from retention to fandom, they're going to change. How we build our sense of purpose, how we build our sense of progression, how we build our optimization, and how we can augment it by updating through paid rewards, through earned rewards, through various forms of exchange, how those elements work to make the game richer, deeper, more engaging. That's the stuff that turns into long-term sustainability. Incredibly important. And I'm going to throw another term at you, and that is the second time user experience. Now, I mean, not everybody will be aware of that. This is a technique that we use. I'll let you decide, if it's the right thing for you. The thing here is, you as a player are not always in your first time mode. What's it like when you come back to the game? What's it like when you come back for the third, the fifth, the 10th time? You need to not just optimize the first time experience, but if you really, really want to keep people playing for the long term, don't make them keep going through the same nonsense. Think about, how many times you're going to pop up the reason to buy this new thing. Think about how many times you're going to say, this is the thing. How are you going to remind them the thing that they may have forgotten when they were first starting? How are you going to use your knowledge of their player behavior to enhance their player experience? These are really important things, as long as you don't get creepy. Don't get creepy. If you start tracking people at an individual level, you can get into a very dark place very quickly, and it feels creepy. It feels weird. We don't want to be that. We want to be a delight to go back to. We want to be given something that I forgot that was a possibility. Let me go for that. What are the moments of joy that you can put into this second time user experience so that as they keep coming back, they have the best possible time? And that will be different from new players. So it's worth bearing in mind those things. So where does this take us? So how do these two things, the core and the context loop, sit together? It's really important to think about how the core and the context loop work together. The core loop is a rapid action. We're going to do multiple core loops, and the core loop will drive the context. Core loop drives us into making sure that we can do the next thing and the next thing and the next thing. And if we do the activity, that's going to help us take our purpose and progress. And then because we've played, we've acted, we've got our rewards. Those actions and rewards are feeding our sense of progression. The interactions that we had, the failures we've had, the successes we've had are going to drive our motivation around optimization. And the payoff in rewards can also be narrative. Narrative is a payoff. So understanding all of those elements and how they fit together is incredibly powerful. So what we're also going to chuck in at you is just to sort of get you thinking a little bit about a couple of other areas. So I don't want you to fall into the ethical pitfalls here. I think it's really important that you bear in mind privacy. It's massively important that people trust you. You do not have long-term engagement with players over years if they don't trust you. And if you want them to trust you, you have to respect them. You have to respect their privacy. There's also some factors, particularly around vulnerable players, that you need to pay attention to. And the first one is transparency. We can avoid a lot of the problems that we're faced with, a lot of the things that are making governments angry, consumer trade groups angry with games, if we simply apply a respect to privacy and a respect to transparency. Don't hide the costs. Tell people what the costs are. If there are no costs, then be clear about it. Don't sneak up on people. Don't put manipulative elements in there. Make sure you're clear about what people should expect and what you are delivering and why. It's really important to be clear. Now there is an interesting kind of conundrum here with the bait and switch style ads we've seen. So the net result, though, is I would argue, whilst there are some really interesting ads out there that are simple and have drawn a lot of people into games, when you completely change the game experience without taking the player on a journey with you, that can cause damage. But interestingly, those same ads also have spawned new games because they helped identify actually games that people wanted to play. Sort of, you were asking a question here. Do I have any warnings or precautions for a game like Sky that's being developed? Blah 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 blah. Or it's streaming. Tell you what, I'm going to come back to that question at the end. I think because I think there's lots of layers in that. Let me instead let's go back to talking about player value. Another thing that's really powerful to avoid ethical pitfalls is to look at your monetization model specifically around player value. What do players care about? What do they want out of your game? Because if you focus on player value and if you look at the exchange mechanisms, whether that's playing, so grind, whether that's watching ads, whether that's paying money or part of a subscription or battle pass, if players don't get what they think is great, you failed them. If you focus on giving them things that are great and making them feel great, you're going to avoid most of the ethical issues and the concerns of manipulation because you're focusing on what they want, which should be a no-brainer. There's also another thing which psychologically is massively important. Make sure your game has moments you can break out. There's two reasons. One is it allows people to stop and pause and relax and rest. It means that it can support their mental health. It can mean that they don't get into the stage where they get overwhelmed. And it also means, which is to your benefit, that they don't burn out. If people finish playing your game feeling exhausted by it, they're not coming back. So if we can create moments of breakout, which create reasons to come back later, we can actually have a more effective, more engaging, more sustainable experience. And at the same time, we protect potentially vulnerable people who maybe don't have the discernment to know when to protect themselves and break out from games. We have a responsibility as designers to create great experiences for the players, but also not to create experiences which are traps for vulnerable people. If we do that, we end up with bad situations where we get legislation angled at us, which is so swathing and so damaging that it even hits the games that are trying to do the right thing by players. And now, unfortunately, that's the situation we've seen over the last few years. That's why we're in the situation where there's an item in the World Health Organization talking about gaming disorder, in my opinion. However, I'm happy to have a conversation about that with other people at another time. Okay, so we've covered core loop. We've covered context loop. Let's talk about the community or cultural loop. So the third layer, and I like to consultancy 3 C's. You could have 3 C's. So consultancy loop. What is that? cultural loop. Sorry, the cultural loop. The cultural loop is thinking about the things that are not the game. I think this is the true metagame. This is what metagame really means. The stuff that's not in the game itself necessarily, but affects the cultural context of the game, the cultural circumstances of the game. So what do I mean by that? I mean thinking about lifestyle, not just life cycle. We've talked about life cycle, but lifestyle is what am I doing right now? For example, am I waiting for a bus? If I am trying to engage the player and I don't understand the moment they're in now, the things that they want from a game right now. Do you remember that chart we had earlier where we saw the reasons why people choose to play a game? We're not cognizant of the motivation. We're not going to be there. And part of that is understanding the device they're using. And now we're talking about mobile most of the time in our circumstance here. However, if you think about a PC, for a PC, I've got to go probably to a den or pull out a laptop. I've got to set up some things. I might have headphones. I might have a whole bunch of other things. There's a lot of setup and prep. There's a lot of barriers to get started, but that's going to have an impact on the kind of games I'm going to play. Same with a console. If I got a console, I'm going to switch my console on. Great. Going to hit the living room or the bedroom or wherever I've got it. But if it's in the living room, like for me, I'm basically making an ownership play of the TV for that evening, and my family are off there watching YouTube on their phones. You know, I do that. I'm guilty. I own up to it. But the key thing I want to try and get across here is these things matter. Thinking about the cultural context. Then separately, we can move on to the next thing. Cooperation, how we cooperate in a game, massively interesting. And that can be in-game, but it can also be through social media platforms. It can be through forums. It can be through Reddit, any number of places. How competition operates, again, massively interesting, because competition drives a different kind of behavior. Not every game is going to have a direct competition. I'm a big fan of asynchronous multiplayer, but equally, not every game has to have multiplayer. Real-time multiplayer games are my first love, I admit, but I'm a 50-plus guy whose reflexes are not great. If I play a first-person shooter nowadays, it's headshot, I'm dead, headshot, I'm dead. But I still have a love for those kind of games. How do you make sure that works? How does the competition work? Obviously, one answer is you have a game like World of Tanks, which is basically Counter-Strike for old people. So that's a joke. I'm sure the guys at Wargaming will be upset about me saying that, but hopefully you get where I'm coming from. There's another element here, and one I want you to take very seriously, and that is zeitgeist. So, to my mind, zeitgeist is all about thinking about the spirit in the wind, the moment of play, the things that I'll watch your game being played by someone else. Think about your audience's audience. Now, I'm not just talking about esports or streaming. Any game, if it doesn't think that the player is going to show the game off to somebody else and it has to look gorgeous, it has to be immediately understandable, it has to feel relevant. If those things aren't done, you're not going to get the most important part of marketing right now, which is that word of mouth that only happens through social platforms. You need that. And it also happens to be the magic formula that makes your trailers work deliciously. So think about the zeitgeist that you're creating. I've got an anonymous question here. Player retention is one of the core loops I've mentioned. How do you implement a good mechanic to maintain a player's retention in a game, regardless of the game genre? So this is where I'm saying we're trying to look at the game mechanics or the whole game in these three layers. We get the core right. We think about how the core, so the start condition, the challenge, resolution, reward, how that feeds into the context loop. So that's the purpose, the progression, the optimization, the narrative. We then think about how that fits into this wider loop, this cultural loop. So thinking about that is massively important. And again, we need to think about the emotions of those. So we need to think about how, when we're going from that kind of lifestyle fit to the cooperation side of things, that we're getting that movement from relief to tension. We want to feel like, oh, am I doing the right thing? How do I do this right? If there's no stakes, We're not going to care. Where's the stakes? How do I get help from other people? How can I feel like I belong? There's a principle called social identity theory. In social identity theory, there's them and us. The cooperation side of things is about the us. I've got to have that tension to feel like I want to belong. If I don't feel like I want to belong, why would I bother? So thinking about that is going to be massively important. Thinking about how that then translates into competition. Competition is essentially a form of cooperation, but it's exemplified, it's leveled up, it's about amplifying, rarefying the air. So I'm now putting my skill on the line, not just whether I'm part of the group, but now I want to excel in the group. So think about what that means and how you're moving there from the anticipation of what the game can deliver you into that fear of missing out. And again, by having this sense of zeitgeist, being able to show off, look what I did. Look at this game, being able to show other people what I did in your game, that zeitgeist moment, that's where we move from the tension into a sense of relief, but also leaving me wanting more. That's the fundamental thing I want to keep people thinking about. It's always about a journey. It is not about a moment. So we've talked about that in detail. We've talked about the emotional side of that. I wanted to mention a little thing here. So one of those elements that we can talk about regarding the way that systems operate is to think a little bit. Oh, actually, I may have switched a little bit here. No, that's right. I'm good. To think about things in terms of how you package your experience. So, for example, one of the things I think is really interesting is thinking about why you get 8 hot dogs but 6 buns. Now, what's that's got to do with context loops and cultural loops and so on and so forth. But it's actually an important factor that if you think about the way your game operates. If you always leave somebody with a sense that there's something I could yet fulfill, I already own my 8 hot dogs. I have my 8 hot dogs, but I've only got 6 buns. I have my 6 hot dogs and buns together. I've got 2 hot dogs left. Well, why don't I go get more buns? Well, when I go get more buns, I get 6 buns. Now I've got 6 buns and only 2 hot dogs. Now I've got 4 buns left over. I better go get more hot dogs. That flow, that always leaving an imbalance in your game is part of this emotional journey, is a part of this route through the player experience. It's part of leaving you something to anticipate in the next play. I think that's incredibly valuable. I'm going to also talk about another type of experience. Now, we've talked about first-time user experience. We've talked about second-time user experience. I want to throw in at you this. Now, this is pretty advanced. Very few games have the chance to do this. But I think you need to think about the lapsed time user experience. What on earth does that mean? That means I haven't played your game for 3 months. How can you get me to come back in? I don't want to go back through the tutorial because in my head, I remember perfectly how to play this. But in reality, I don't. In reality, I've forgotten how to play this game entirely. But you need to teach me in a different way to get back in the game so I don't just go and throw my toys in the pram and get angry. It's the game's fault that I don't remember how to play it. So thinking about how you provide an easy return, motivation, re-engagement, these rewards for coming back that can get people who've established an experience playing the game so that they can come back and feel satisfied again, that is a superpower. That takes you to the next level. So I thoroughly recommend thinking about that. And let's remember, engagement is retention. Retention is revenue. That's what this is about. And so how do these all fit together? These all fit together. This is a flow. We've got the second hand of the activity flowing around, creating that driver, going through the start conditions of the challenge. This is the integrated way to think about your experience. We've got the sense of purpose and progression that's driving that further forward. But equally, we've got the cultural loop, which is driving us with that longer term engagement. We can't just deliver amazing experiences if we don't think about how these flow together and how each of them take the player on an emotional journey where we can start off with a state of relief and relaxation with anticipation, and we can move ourselves from that state to a state of tension, still anticipating, and from that state of tension with anticipation, moving that to fear of missing out and tension, which is when we are so deeply involved in the game. And then when we succeed, that's when we move over to the relief stage where we can move forward. That is the place where you can really start to unlock the potential re-engagement and sustaining of that audience. Because at the end of the day, we need to make sure that the player's coming back in 20 minutes, in an hour, in 2 hours, in 4 hours, in 2 days, in a week, in a month, in a year. We want people to keep coming back. If you haven't thought about these elements, you are not going to sustain an engaged audience. But don't take my word for it. Don't take my insights, my thoughts. You need to use data. That's why setting up your servers in advance is important. That's why I talk about setting up config in advance. I want to know what config settings work with which audiences, when and how. I want to be able to use that to forecast what next month's going to look like, what's next year's going to look like. We can't forecast effectively if we don't know we've got a sustainable business. And being able to understand performance, to be able to do testing, to be able to understand how we engage the audience, data. You need to use that data to provide you with a starting point and then apply your insights, your design skills to deliver that effectively. And that's it. So we've talked about creating a core loop. We've talked about the context loop, and we've talked about the cultural loop. We've talked about why these ways of thinking about your game, the ways of slicing your game and the player experience are critically important, and how it's so essential to really understand where your game fits in this process. And if you can do that, if you can get that to work, you're going to have a much better chance of sustaining and maintaining longer and longer term audiences. And then that's where the lessons from the previous webinar, by the way, you can get that webinar. It's on the website. If you want to get a link to that, we'll make sure that that's available. You can watch the other thing. I'll give you insight to that. You will have missed the workshop, unfortunately, but if anyone's interested in that, following up on that workshop at any point, we're very happy to rerun that. So look at the techniques for monetizing. But next time, when we go into the third webinar, we're going to talk about game economy design. So we're talking about the balancing systems. We're talking about the components of, maintaining and sustaining your game. So those are the 3 topics. This has been about engaging, retention, and design. Very happy to answer any questions that people have. But hopefully I've left you with these thoughts, that I need to think about not just how my game mechanics work, but how they drive a reason to replay. And then once I've done that, the context in which that replay happens, so I can sustain it for a longer period of time. And finally, how the cultural fit for all of those play methods connects with the audience, so that you build fandoms, audiences that sustain, and they become your primary driver to find and sustain players. So does anyone have any questions? Again, feel free to use the Q&A for that. I can happily talk through the other questions that arise. I'm trying to sort of have a look through the comments that have been made before to see if there's any elements in there. I think the question was about a device-oriented or rather streaming-oriented game. Again, it depends on what you mean by streaming. Very few games are not connected. If you're on a sustainable game and you don't have any data servers at all, that's going to cause you some issues. I wouldn't recommend it in this day and age. However, that doesn't mean I don't think you should be able to play offline. And there are techniques you can do to make sure that, for example, when you start up the game, you can get the server in the background, always make it the background so that the player can still act. The server in the background can just check if the configurations in the game are up to date, and if they're not, download the latest ones. And if you're smart about that, and you've got schedule dates tied into the way those configurations are set up, then you can upload things to the player in advance of when they should operate. So they don't have to be online on the very day that they're playing that game. And also you can build in some safeguards, and there's so many safeguards you will need to build in, particularly if you've got in-app purchases. Now, if you've got a pay upfront game, that's less problematic, but there are still issues there. But there are lots of different techniques you can think about if you're going on that server versus non-server route. But I would always suggest having a server. You don't necessarily have to have it running continuously. You don't have to necessarily have a multiplayer game to benefit from these techniques. And yes, I've tried to keep this at a relatively high level, but this is where you've got the chance to ask questions. And in particular, when we go into the workshop next week, 2 weeks' time. Workshop's going to be in 2 weeks' time. For people who are involved in that workshop, we're going to take you through an example. You're going to pick a game. It's not going to be one of your games. Well, normally not. You're going to pick a game that's well known, and in groups, we're going to work through each of these layers for that game. And we're going to look at what that means and how we specifically apply these techniques in a purposeful way. So if you really want to get into deep and dirty kind of like thinking about how to use this, if you want that lower level interaction, it's really important to make sure that you participate in that. I'm very happy to do that. By the way, just while I have the chance, and I'll come to the questions in a second, I think it's also just, like I say, I'm going to remind you that the webinar recording for the previous one is available. I think we talked about putting a link out somewhere. It's also on the Pocket Gamer website, so easy to find. And then we've also got tickets, obviously, for the session on the 28th. And not only do we have an early bird discount currently running till Friday, we also have a specific code for you guys right now. If you happen to use the code WEB2, it's going to give you an extra 10% discount off, but you have to book it by Friday if you want the early bird discount. That 10% should still work, but then it'll be against the full price. So obviously, if you want to get tickets now, and there are very limited places on that one, but if you want to get access to that, then please feel free. And as I say, that's all going to be about being hands-on, looking at specific examples of specific games and trying to make sure that you can apply these techniques at hands-on. Anyway, back to the questions. So I'm going to go back to questions. How do I tackle audiences if the game's genre is very saturated in the market? Oh, there's so many things there. Right. So the first thing there is you need to understand where the differentiation factor is. So what is it that you're doing that is going to engage that player? Why? I mean, again, it just reinforces the necessity of understanding why a player cares. If you don't understand why the player is going to care about your game, you're not going to get there. So that's why it's incredibly important that you establish an understanding of the lifestyle fit of that player. There may be an opportunity because you discover that, let's say, what's the classic over-established genre? Let's say match 3. You got a match 3 game, okay? Most match 3 games, we're playing either when we're waiting for a bus, waiting for a coffee, waiting for a friend, or sat on the toilet. Okay. So what is it about that circumstance that can make someone choose your game first? What's that about that circumstance that somebody can go, I want to do that one thing that's different? You know, a lot of those games are over-established. They've been there. Don't get me wrong. Candy Crush still retains a lot of people's attention. It's an amazing game. But what is the thing that you're bringing to the market? Sometimes it's going to be genre. Sometimes it's going to be theme. Sometimes it's going to be a subtly different way of playing, a logical twist that is satisfying inherently. So those are the things you need to think about. The reason why that audience, and you need to define that audience, you need to understand that audience, you need to test against that audience, and you need to prove that context, that core game mechanic works. One of the techniques we use is actually taken from the hyper-casual world. So what we do is we forget for the moment the context and the cultural loop, and we purely test 3, 4, 5, 6 different variations of the kind of mechanic we want to make playable. We create a 30-second trailer of what that mechanic could feel like before we even build it. and then we'll test that. We'll test that usually through spending small amounts of money on a trailer, £50 a day for 3 days on Meta or Google Ads. Which variant has the most success? Then once we've done that, that's when we're going to apply the context loop. And we'll try 3 or 4 different ways of sustaining that player's purpose and progression on optimization. And again, test that, get the one that works best. And finally, we look at the cultural fit. And that often that's going to come down to the art, that's going to come down to the narrative style. But again, it comes down to understanding the audience and test. Hopefully that answers that question. Next up, do you find applying this model to any successful game, or have you found any? So as I think it was Roy was saying, this is a high-level description. I'm trying to establish principles of working practice that can be applied to virtually any repeatable game. Now, outliers do exist. Don't get me wrong. And often those outliers, though, are more about the focus that you place, where you place that focus. But the principle of not just looking at the core elements of the loop, which is what everybody does. If you can divide any game into a core loop, but to look at beyond the core loop, to look at the nuance behind the core loop by going from core loop to context and from context to culture, you already bring your focus out. And you're able to find the opportunities for scale and deeper engagement. But more than that, by applying the emotional journey, by understanding what the emotions of the player are, by caring what the players care about as they transition from step to step to step, by taking them on this journey from rest with anticipation, from anticipation and tension, from anticipation and tension to fear of missing out and tension, from that to relief, but still fear of missing out. Therefore, I want more. Therefore, I've got my hot dog economics desire to satisfy this untapped potential. So I play again. That is absolutely applicable to any repeatable game. It's just what level do you look at applying it to this specific game? Hope that answers the question. And then the team out here are saying they're working on a sports game. How do they engage their players if the gameplay is repetitive? Well, exactly as I'm trying to describe. But anyway, okay. Especially with the sports game, the mechanics don't really change. How do I keep the comeback? So there are 2 things to think about. So data is content, but also players are probably the best form of content. So in a sports game where you've got repetitive play, creating a context in which those players can see their functional ability, where it can make it meaningful. And actually, that's really the heart of this. Why is this stuff meaningful? We have a purpose because we need players to feel that the play was meaningful. We have a sense of progression because we're going to see that that meaningful action did something meaningful in our long-term engagement with the game, that it was worth us staying playing. So thinking about those elements in your sports game, and it could be the game doesn't change that much. For example, it might be shots on goal, and that might be it. You might be doing a flip. I worked on a bunch of these where paper toss style game. In fact, one of the most funny ones was the one that was based on Cristiano Ronaldo. It was a licensed IP. We had million downloads and 0 players. Everybody just wanted to have the icon on their phone showing Cristiano Ronaldo. They didn't actually want to play the game. No matter what we did, no matter what efforts we put in, there was just no way of rescuing that game. It's such a sad thing, especially for the guy who made it. I feel terribly sad for him. He did a fantastic job. He made a really nice game, but we just couldn't shift the needle. And that's, again, about understanding what the players value. So in your point here, you're making a sports game. What do your players value? How do you show that what they value is delivered? How do you show that what they value that's delivered is meaningful? And that can come through the data. So what's their target score? What's their, their accuracy? How do they rate against other people? That can be real-time play. That can be asynchronous play. By the way, I haven't said it 3 times already. I'll probably say it again. Asynchronous play is fantastic. Or it can be solo. But if it's solo, getting data from what other people do should be straightforward too. So whilst, the trouble is solo play does not feel special in the same way that seeing how other people do it. One of the most powerful things I've ever seen in a game is with the original episode 1 of The Walking Dead, where you saw 26% of people took the same action as you. The rest took the other action and somebody else died. That, whether it's true or not, I don't care. I felt I'd made a decision that was special. Make me feel special. I hope that answers the question. Okay, on that note, I think we are at time. I am happy to take one last question if anyone wants to rapidly run at it. But in the meantime, I will go, just remind you that obviously we have a number of other things that we've got coming on. We've talked about the upcoming workshop, which will be on the 28th. And obviously sign up now to get that discount now and to be able to take part in that. We've also got an economy design webinar like this, which we're going to do on September the 4th. And we've also got that follow-up hands-on workshop. And again, same principle here. The webinars are going to give you a taste of the theory, the principles, and then you're going to get to try to apply it in the workshop. So I thoroughly recommend you guys getting involved in that. So with all said and done, I think we are done. You can get hold of me at that email address. I'm very easy to find on most platforms as @Athanasius, whether that's the platform formerly known as Twitter or whatever else. I'm also all over the place in terms of places like Discord and so on and so forth. Please feel free to reach out to me. I'm very happy to answer questions. And obviously, I hope that was useful. And on that note, thanks all.